So, good morning, and thank you for coming out to participate. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions, concerns, anything you want to bring up? Um, any comments, issues? Okay. If are any of you in the San Francisco Bay Area right now? Anybody? Yes. Um, Today at 1 o'clock, I'm going to be hosting a Q&A session. There's going to be a free concert with a Cuban jazz singer named Daime Arrocena at the Yerba Buena Gardens on 3rd and Mission Street, San Francisco. And I'm going to be doing the Q&A, and we're going to be actually talking about a lot of the issues that are in this class about music and social change. And she's a Cuban jazz singer, very young, who's very interested in using music as a force for social change. So that's the conversation we're going to have. It's from 1 to 3, and I think the discussion starts at 3, but it's pretty amazing. It's free. So if you're in the area, it's near the Montgomery BART station in San Francisco. So come out. It's really fun. Hang there on the grass, and free concerts are always good. So, and if you come, introduce yourself. You see who I am, the bald guy, and you can say hello. So the midterm. So I think the midterm is fairly straightforward, but let's go into it and look at some of the strategies of how you would approach these questions and kind of where you would look for the answers in all the material that we're covering and some different strategies for looking at these. So what I'm looking for is not a specific length of answers, but I'd like you to give some examples and kind of be very clear and specific about what you're saying. So try to back up your arguments with some historical context and some detail and examples, if you can. So the question: how were young Mexican muralists influenced by the 1910 revolution, and what were the objectives of the early mural movement in Mexico? So there's two things here, right? There's two things that we're asking is how were they influenced and what were their objectives? So if we look at how they were influenced, we could see these are artists. Many of them were trained artists who had gone to the art school, either art schools in Mexico or some had studied abroad. But the influences on artists were some of the influences that impacted the whole society with the revolution. And if we look at what those influences are, we can see, well, the Mexican Revolution had a profound disrupting effect on Mexican society, disrupting many of the established institutions that had existed since the independence. They disrupted, and before they disrupted the power of the church, right, is one thing. So we could see a change in morals, in moral values, as we see the revolution begins to disrupt many of the attitudes in society, the social values. We could see the one of them would be the prioritizing or putting the Eurocentric values above the mestizo culture. So one would be to give way or to prioritize or to highlight the nature of mestizo culture, which hadn't really been looked at very carefully or hadn't been respected. And the picture of Mexican identity painted under the Porfirio Diaz presidency was one that was kind of conflictive to the reality. So we could see people beginning to explore Mexican identity and Mexican culture, explore new visions of Mexican history. We can see that much of the indigenous history of Mexico had been rewritten And this was one of the things that the Catholic Church did, was in the 19th century, at the end of 19th centuries, begin to rewrite or to document Mexican history, but from the Catholic perspective. Even this is where we see the naming of the indigenous groups. For instance, the Aztecs, as we know them, who called themselves Mexica and were known as Mexica. Aztec is a name made up by the Spanish. That's derived from Aztlan, the homeland of the Mexica people, which was the southwest of the United States. So they began to make the Purepecha, who were called Tarasco, and names like Zapotec and Mixtec, etc. These are names that were made up by the Spanish to describe these indigenous groups, many who had very distinct identities and cultures. So one of the things, also the description of mestizo and the origin of the mestizo is something that was conflictive. And this goes back to the story of Malinche. Malinche, was a woman who was given to the Hernan Cortez party as a slave when the Spanish first arrived. The Totonacos, who were the indigenous group that first encountered the Spanish arriving at the coast of Veracruz, gave them an offering of slave women, 5 slave women, among them Malinche, who had been a Mayan princess who was very adept at languages and spoke the Nahua language, the language of the Aztecs, or as they call themselves, Mexica, and she also spoke Maya, and she quickly learned Spanish. She had a very keen ear, learned Spanish, and became the consort of Hernan Cortez and his translator. And many people argued that it was her advice to Cortez and her analysis providing Cortez information about the indigenous society of Mexico that allowed him to defeat the Aztecs. So she's known as the mother of the first mestizo, which is a conflicted identity then. If the mother is a slave and the father is the slave owner, who does the child identify with? So this leads to this conflicted idea of mestizo culture. And you'll see Carlos Fuentes wrote about this, and we'll see the sons of Malinche. And so we can see that the rescue or the revindication or redrawing of mestizo identity becomes an important part of this movement and one of the influences. So we can see also the influence of the Mexican Revolution in destroying the system of peonage, of the large landowners who had people as debt slaves. We can see, again, the breaking of the power of the church, breaking of many of the social institutions that governed Mexico, which allowed for people to examine their own lives with fresh perspectives. So some of the influences of the revolution we can see are these ideas also that pushed the Mexican Revolution. We can see the ideas of Emiliano Zapata, an agrarian revolutionary who many have deemed an anarcho-syndicalist, somebody who was pushing for new forms of land ownership, but not necessarily along the Marxist terms, but going back to a communal form of government, of governing of land usage and stewardship, going back to recreating some of the communal forms. Some of the other leaders, Pancho Villa, the mule driver, who represents a group of independent contractors, people who were not peons, who were not farmers, and Villa had a very different perspective. So anyway, so we can see some of the different forces of the revolution that were unleashed, different motivations. We can see that these influence people. But again, this idea of breaking up the society and painting a new vision of Mexico. So some of the other influences, we could see what else was happening at this time. Well, we could see the Russian Revolution had a huge impact on Mexican painters, because the Russian Revolution happening parallel to the Mexican Revolution is a similar uprising against the Tsar, who was an all-powerful ruler. And it's, again, an uprising of many different sectors of society for many different reasons. But the difference between the Russian Revolution and Mexico, the revolutionary leaders were not really ready to take power. Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa and others were not equipped to take power, to rule the country, to propose a strategy for directing the country. And we can see that other factions, other sectors of the elite stepped in to take control. So in the Russian Revolution, we see the Bolsheviks, a party that based their ideas on Karl Marx's writings, were the ones that were able to take power and tell people, look, we want to erase these inequalities of the past, and this is what we're proposing, is let's take away private property. Let's take away greed and materialism as the basic motivating force in society. So we can see the beginning of the first socialist country. And this influences the Mexican revolutionaries and artists, because within this, the Russian revolutionaries begin to question everything. So part of what they're questioning, again, creating a society from scratch, from zero, let's start from the very beginnings. So in the Russian Revolution, in the first years during the 1920s, they're questioning the nuclear family. They're questioning the concept of monogamy, the role of men and women in society, the role of work. Who should work? Why? What? How are they compensated? All of these different things were up for discussion. But one of the main things that was relevant to the artists is the discussion that went on about the role of artists and intellectuals in society. What are artists going to do? If they're going to be given their sustenance, if art is seen as a worthwhile enterprise of something that adds some value to society, what is that value? And how is it going to be compensated? And what is going to be the role of art? So this discussion in the Soviet Union really spread all over the world as artists begin to question, well, if we're revolutionaries, and artists, how do we combine these two things? How do we become revolutionary artists? What is our role? Anyone that's gone to art school can see that the teaching of art currently and in the past has been for the artist to be expressive, to create beautiful works that will resonate with people and allow them to reflect, but not necessarily to make social commentaries. In most art schools, that is not seen as the mission of an artist, is to paint something that's going to provoke political and social discussion, to have people question things. And if you go to museums, you'll see the painting, the purple canvas with a green dot in the middle or something like this. And you read, well, this is a way of focusing attention and contrasting the dark and the light and these kinds of things. So it's about reflection and a way for people to kind of look and use a painting as a means of looking inside themselves to reflect on their lives and reflect on other things, rather than making very blatant social commentaries and political commentaries. So this is one of the huge changes. Even the concept of public art, of creating public art, of large monumental works in public spaces. What's the point of this? This is something very, very directed and something very new, although this also existed in many of the indigenous societies of Mexico. If you go to Montalban, you'll see that there's huge frescoes and murals, and in many of the sacred spaces that were created and public spaces that were created that still exist, we can see these types of murals that are talking about history, ways of life, etc., documenting kind of the way people lived in their worldview. So we could see the Mexican artists influenced by the Russian Revolution, by these ideas and these changing concepts of what art should be and about public art. They're also influenced, looking back in the past, how their ancestors used art as a form of communication, how they used images to relay messages, and they tried to take these things. So some of the other influences, we can see the influences of European modern art, the Cubists, the Expressionists, etc. But also um, many of the artists looking back at the Mexican folk art styles, about the mythology and the aesthetics that are embedded in Mexican culture, and trying to rescue these and use the images of Mexican folk culture to create links and to help people link and imagine themselves. So is this clear? This part of the influences? So objectives, what were their objectives? What were they trying to do? Well, you can see that the muralists are commissioned. The first murals are created, commissioned by the Secretary of Education, the Minister of Education, Jose Vasconcelos, who wrote the book, The Cosmic Race. And he is using this as a part of a larger education and literacy program to create literacy, to bring literacy to Mexican people. And you can see in the painting that many of you wrote about, La Maestra Rural, the idea of training teachers to go out and teach literacy. And in La Maestra Rural, you see a woman teaching in the middle of a field or in a farm, at the gateway to a farm or a hacienda, because there were no schools in much of Mexico, so that they would create schools anywhere to bring literacy. The problem with this was that there was no materials, there was no curriculum, there were no books that documented Mexican history and culture from the perspective of the revolutionaries. And the site of these murals at the preparatory school was where teachers were trained. And many of these young teachers were revolutionaries who spread. And to this day, we see many Mexican teachers play this role as revolutionaries in the community because they're spreading a curriculum that is talking about these new Mexican values, these the basic fundamental principles of the revolution that were outlined in the 1917 Constitution, which are not always put into practice, which is where we see the contradictions. Is that the teachers are spreading this revolutionary gospel that is rarely put into practice in Mexico, or many times in deformed ways, as we can see. So their objectives was to create forms of public art which would spread these new values, which would retell Mexican history from a very Mexican perspective. Again, the influence of social realism coming from the Soviet Union is the idea of also making art, the images in the art, recognizable to ordinary people, to working people, so that they objected to abstraction, to a lot of complicated symbolism, and they wanted to keep things very straightforward. So this was a huge discussion because many artists said, well, these are then political cartoons. If we make everything recognizable, then it takes away the power of people to reflect and to project, again, their own ideas. So in these discussions, we can see that the ideas come up that, well, yes, they should be realistic, using realistic images, and that they should reflect social issues and historical issues. Again, allowing people to visualize themselves and their past, to see themselves, to protagonize the proletariat or the working people in these murals, to be able to see themselves, their strength, their dignity, and the beauty, the aesthetics that are present in Mexican culture. And we can see a lot of earth tones, the trying to use the colors that are popular or used in Mexican folk art, the colors that surround you in Mexico, the way people paint their houses, the pottery, etc., to kind of bring these things in, and also to depict and allow people to reflect on these social issues that are confronting Mexico and to visualize other outcomes instead of the inevitable, what appears inevitable, to visualize other outcomes of how things might be. And we see Marx in this, we see workers rising up, etc. So allowing people to think that other things might be possible, other futures might be possible. And this becomes an important role. Now we see the contradiction that these are painted on government buildings. Is the government actually doing this? So this becomes one of the conflicts, that the government doesn't stop the muralists from doing this because they see they can use this as a mask, that these murals reflect many of the ideological premises or the fundamental ideas of the Mexican Constitution about land reform, about spreading education, about the civil rights, etc. All of these things, the rights of workers and peasants, but the implementation is often not carried out. So we can see that the government doesn't object to these murals because we can see the rhetoric of many of the government officials also reflects what these murals are depicting, but in practice, they're not carried out, which is a different thing. So the objectives of the mural movement, again, are to create a series of visualizations of Mexican history and culture, to help people pursue a way of defining Mexican identity, and to promote a very positive image of the mestizo people. So these forms of public art, the objectives of the early mural movement, are laid out in many of the manifestos that you can read. The one that Siqueiros published, that's in the Mexican Muralist book. Craven's book also talks a lot about the motivations of the muralists and what they were trying to do. And we can look at the objectives of the mural movement that are laid out very clearly by Vasconcelos. So is this clear? I'm sorry I went on so long about it. So what I'm asking you to do is be very specific in your answers. Use details, use examples to make your points. Okay, are we clear? Okay, how did Diego Rivera view the role of an artist in society? How is this expressed in one of his murals? You need to look at the interview with his daughter. Did anybody have trouble finding the interview?
No.
Everyone found it? Okay, good. So no need to cite. If you're using the course materials, then there's no need to cite. If you're using something outside the course materials, then cite it. I don't think you need to use anything outside of the course materials, but if you do, then cite it. Is that clear? I don't want to burden you in a short piece to have to do that. So in the interview, one of Diego Rivera's daughters, Ruth, asks him, Dad, some of my friends at the university want to know what you think the role of the artist should be in society. And he goes on for an hour talking about this. So I think it's very enlightening in many ways, because he examines really his view historically of the role of art and the role of the artist. He talks about art as a form of nourishment for the imagination, which he says is as important as food, as a form of nutrition. Now, what do we think about this? How is art a form of nutrition for the imagination? Why is this so important? What would it be like if people didn't have that? if there was no art and they just went to work and came home and they had no kind of stimulation of seeing other depictions of reality, um, well, it would make it difficult for people to imagine other outcomes than what's in front of them, right? And than what's apparent, what's in front of them. So um, you can look at his ideas of art as a form of propaganda. That art is not objective journalism, but is the opinions and the views of an artist who's kind of expressing themselves as a person living through this historical moment, this particular reality, and through an artistic vision that will add more depth. Again, different than a news article or a pamphlet, would give more depth and allow people to kind of to imagine themselves in the scene. And again, I think Rivera uses very clear examples to lay this out. Now, when you find an example of this, when you're providing an example, what you might want to do is show how this example is exemplifying again what he's saying of how this is a form of nourishment for Mexican people. And just to explain this briefly. For instance, the woman carrying the calla lilies. How is this an expression of what Rivera is talking about? Again, he's showing, he's making a very clear statement about the beauty, the strength of working people, about the role of flowers, the appreciation for art, and the relationship between flowers as a form of devotion or giving thanks, the relationship between humans and the forces of nature. Again, this is something, a very important question, that this existential question of why are we here and what are we doing in this small part and what are we supposed to be doing? Is going out and getting a PhD as important as growing flowers? So, and what is the importance? What is the role of these things? And so it allows people to kind of reflect on these issues, but also providing examples of the strength of Mexican culture. So is this clear? Anybody have any doubts, questions, comments? It'd be nice to hear somebody else say something. Um, it's hard for me to just stare at the screen and talk to you without any feedback from you. Somebody tell me that you're okay and we'll move on. Okay. Okay, good. So describe the differences in art, in the approach to art of the following artists. How did their artistic vision differ? It should be visions, I guess. So I'll fix that. So what I'm asking you to do here, there's really no right and wrong answer to this question. And again, to none of the questions, there's really no right and wrong answer. It's just if you can provide some backup, if you can make an argument and provide some example and detail to support it, then that would be a correct answer. In this case, in this one, what I'm asking you to do is to try to describe their styles in your own words, or you can use the way that the authors in the course materials describe them, but try to describe how you see what they did, how you understand what their approach to art is. So is it the same? Well, in some ways you could say that it is, that there's similarities, but there's also big differences. Can you identify the work of the different artists? At this point, you probably could. If you saw a Siqueiros or Rivera or an Orozco painting, you could probably point out those subtle details or those subtle stylistic differences. So this is what I'm asking you to do here. To just in a couple paragraphs each, describe their approach to art and how their vision differed from the other artists. So you can look at the documentaries, you can look at their works and try to use your own subjective criteria. You can look at the readings. And here we're bringing in Frida Kahlo for the first time, and there's a lot of material about her um, in the coursework. Plus, it's easy to find on the web. And although she's not a muralist, I put it in here as a contrast again between the male artists, and again, most of the muralists were artists. I mean, were male, and this is part of the patriarchal system in Mexico that made it. And Frida Kahlo was never allowed or invited to paint murals. She ended up, all of her paintings were done in her own studio or in her own home. So you can bring this up also. So is this one clear? Okay. How did the Zapatista movement of the 1990s transform Mexican culture? So most people answering this question make the mistake of just describing the Zapatista movement, but how did it transform Mexican culture? That's the question. Again, we've been looking at how the mural movement, and I previously had put this section at the end of the course, but I put it in here just to have some continuity to see how there were similarities between what the mural movement did and the Zapatista movement. So if we look at what the Zapatista movement did and how it transformed Mexican culture, in a sense, it was similar to the mural movement in the ways that it transformed the culture, because it represents a break, somebody questioning the norms and kind of breaking open the mainstream political system. The Zapatista uprising in 1994 of Mayan communities in Chiapas brings to the forefront the presence of indigenous people in Mexico, something that had been ignored by modern Mexican society in many ways. So the creation of the Aztec myth, something that comes out during the Porfirio Diaz years, promoted by the Catholic Church, the idea of the Aztec warrior carrying the maiden in front of the two volcanoes that you see on every calendar for a bakery or a meat market. This is the myth of the Aztec past, the idea of the Aztecs as the noble people, who are the forefathers of Mexican culture, as different from the indigenous people who might be sweeping the street outside, or selling tortillas or something like this. So again, the idea is the Zapatistas show that the indigenous people are still very strong, that the indigenous cultures are still present and important and can play a role in Mexican society. So if you examine what they're talking about, were the Zapatistas trying to take state power? Well, probably in the beginning they were, but their message transformed as they realized that the Mexican people were not ready to rise up again, that people wanted to avoid the bloodshed and conflict, but they were willing to accept these new ideas. And we see the idea that they're introducing of of recognizing and promoting some of the values of the indigenous cultures that have permeated Mexican society. So going back to communal forms of government, communal forms of land ownership, and Chiapas to this day becomes a laboratory for social experimentation. And in San Cristobal de las Casas, there's 6 universities today, including graduate schools that are at the cutting edge of the ecological studies and sustainable agriculture and land use, because they're some of the only places in the world where these communal agricultural practices are carried out, where it can be a laboratory for these forms of social experimentation. So in the film, The Sixth Son, you can get an idea of the impact that people had, the impact that the Zapatistas had on Mexican culture. And we can see a renewal of indigenous identity in Mexico, and people after the Zapatista movement beginning to hyphenate their identity, similar to the United States, where people will say, I'm Italian American, Mexican American, Swedish American, etc. In Mexico, you see people saying, I'm Maya, Mexicano, Purepecha, etc., and beginning to hyphenate and include their um, indigenous connection in their identity. And we see language schools teaching the indigenous language popping up all over Mexico, as people are thinking that it's important that their children speak these languages of their ancestors. So we can see this as an important element. So is this clear? Okay. The last one is probably the most difficult. Describe the topic of your research paper and explain how the topic is relevant to the material presented in the class. I don't know yet is not a valid answer. So I'm not going to grade this question, but I'm just going to help you focus. This is a way of me giving you some feedback. I've read hundreds and thousands of papers about Frida Kahlo and etc. So I could give you some guidance. I might be able to suggest some sources or maybe another approach. So what I'm asking you to do is to stay away from a bio, that don't write the biography of Frida Kahlo. But again, what was the impact of her work? How did it reflect what was going on in Mexico? If you're looking, for a topic, let's say you can propose one, and then as you begin, you can change your mind. You can write to me, hey, I changed my mind and I decided to paint about graffiti artists in Tijuana or rappers in Monterrey, or the cumbia punk movement of Monterrey, or whatever. So, and you don't have to write about what we've studied to this moment. We're going to be talking about Nicaragua and Cuba and Latino artists in the United States. So you can bring up any of these topics. So this would be the moment to do it. Oh, I'm going to look at the influence of, um, Carlos Santana on Chicano muralists. So anything that that is exciting you, kind of some idea that has come out of this class that's inspired you, and that's the idea. And so be brave, and this is the moment where you can express it. Someone have something? I heard a voice there. Someone with a question? Okay. If there's nothing else, I just want to really tell you I really appreciate your time coming, and I'm very inspired by the work that I'm getting from you, and I hope the class is worthwhile, and feel free to let me know if you're having any problems, any challenges with the